Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. We have talked extensively about this USC program over the last couple of weeks, but a lot of our conversations around this USC program have been dealing with the recruiting trail the last couple of weeks. I think, for lack of better terms, I'm just itching to talk about some football that we are going to see this fall. I want to dive into my 5 biggest question marks for this USC team heading into 2024, and I preface that by saying these questions they certainly have answers in 2024, but I think the conversation is if USC reaches their potential in the fall, these question marks are probably going to get answered by USC. Extremely excited to get into it. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys, to the USC fans. Y'all know I love talking this program. The amount of support you guys show, whether we're previewing what we're going to see in the fall, whether we're talking the recruiting trail, all the fight-ons in the comments section, all the engagement you guys show it really does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Much more importantly, I would love to hear from the USC fans in relation to your biggest question marks about this USC team heading into 2024. And without further ado, let's get into my first question, which is a little bit broad, but what does this offense look like heading into 2024? And it obviously starts with replacing one of the better quarterbacks that we've seen play college football in a very long time in Caleb Williams. What is the difference going to be in this USC offense? And I think the question is less, is Miller Moss going to be a good quarterback for USC? I think a lot of USC fans are sitting there and say, hey, we saw what Miller Moss did against Louisville, a very good defense in that bowl game. We even broke down the film a couple of months ago. We are confident, not only Miller Moss, but what Lincoln Riley can do in terms of developing quarterbacks. The track record is really just too strong for us to be skeptical about the quarterback position. I think the more intriguing question for me is, does the schematics of this USC offense change a little bit going to Miller Moss from Caleb Williams? I think the answer is yes. I think the answer, how this USC offense changes, I first am interested to see if USC runs the football a little bit more than they did in 2023, and if the USC fans who've been rocking with the fellas the last couple of months, really, we talked a lot about USC maybe trying to run the football more in the 2023 season. Now, they ran the ball one of the least amounts in the country. I believe they threw the ball the 10th most in the country in 2023. And it's really hard to blame Lincoln Riley because you had one of the best quarterbacks we've seen play college football in the last decade running this offense. You want to give him his opportunity to impact the football game. That being said, one of the sneaky storylines was USC ran the football very well in 2023. They just didn't run it that often. And I wonder, with Miller Moss taking over the quarterback spot, does USC lean on the run game a little bit more than they did in the 2023 season? I think, secondly, they asked Caleb Williams to play a lot of backyard football. And I think at times, obviously, that really helped this USC offense, but at times it certainly hurt this USC offense too. I wonder if you see a little bit more structure to the offense. And again, going back to what we think Miller Moss does at a very high level, it is playing within this offense, getting the football out on time quickly to his playmakers. And you look at this USC offense, specifically in the wide receiver room, you see that starting lineup: Deuce Robinson, Jacoby Lane, Zachariah Branch, Mekhi Lemon. They're all going into year 2. All 4 of those cats are probably some of the more talented wide receivers that we see in the country. There is a large possibility that we're looking at a top 5 wide receiver room in the country for USC. I wonder if Lincoln Riley designing this offense in 2024 takes a little bit more pressure off the quarterback spot and kind of lets Miller Moss just be the point guard of this USC offense. That's what we saw him do in that Louisville game. It obviously worked exceptionally well. I think you're going to see USC fundamentally change this offense just a little bit, right? I think there's going to be a little bit more reliance on the playmakers around the quarterback position. I think they're going to run the football a little bit more, which I really hope they do, because again, they ran the football not a lot in 2023, but they ran the football extremely well. And we think this offensive line can be pretty good. You got Woody Marks, Quentin Joyner. It's a solid running back room. I think you're going to see some changes to this USC offense and really how it runs. I think number 2 on the offensive side of the football is, can Mason Murphy take a step at that right tackle position, because we look at this offensive line specifically on the left side and say, Elijah Page at left tackle, there's a lot of optimism that he can be kind of an all-conference caliber guy for USC. Emmanuel Pregnon going year 2 into this program, he is just a road grader, can move bodies off the line of scrimmage. And then obviously Jonah at center. I look at the left side of this offensive line and say, I really like what it is. And I think you have some questions about Alani Noah just because you haven't seen him. But I think the one big question mark that we have on this USC offensive line is Mason Murphy, right? It was a rocky road, to say the least, with Mason Murphy in the 2023 year. If Mason Murphy can take that step at right tackle, become a solid right tackle for USC, I look at this USC offensive line and say, I think this USC offensive line could surprise a lot of people in the 2024 year. I think a lot of the outsiders from this USC program just look at USC and kind of assume they're going to be weak along the line of scrimmage. I think this offensive line in the Big Ten can be a really quality unit, but I think a lot of that has to do with Mason Murphy taking that step at that right tackle position. Now, moving on to the defensive side of the football, and the first question that I want to go to, and it's not going to be on the defensive line. We're going to get to the defensive line. I want to talk about the linebacker room and specifically Mason Cobb. I think there's a lot of chatter around this USC defensive line. It obviously wasn't good enough last year. I think the biggest problem with this USC defense last year was the linebacker play. I mean, Mason Cobb, Tacky Curtis, far too inconsistent during their reps for USC in 2023. And why I want to single out Mason Cobb is Mason Cobb, to me, is one of the more fascinating players heading into 2024. You go back to the 2022 season, Mason Cobb was an all-conference player for Oklahoma State. And then in 2023, I understand that he was dealing with some injuries. That certainly tells you a little bit, but it was a massive step back. And I think the biggest question for USC, you bring in Matt Entz to coach the linebacker room. Dan Lynn did a phenomenal job with his linebackers at UCLA. Can you get Mason Cobb back to that all-conference linebacker that's just an eraser at that second level for this USC defense? We've seen him play really good football. We didn't see him play good football in 2023. Can you get back to that 2022 form where he had 38 run stops, 96 tackles, 13 tackles for a loss? Mason Cobb was so good for Oklahoma State and just took a massive step back in 2023. Can he get back to that form? Massive storyline, because you look at Easton Mascarenas-Arnold, all Pac-12 player from Oregon State. We're pretty confident he's going to be good. And you got a guy in Eric Gentry who, y'all know how I feel about Eric Gentry, just a defensive chess piece. Rajon Davis, a guy that played quality football during the reps that he got. I want to see a step up from this linebacker room, but most importantly, from the consistency. When you look at Mason Cobb, one, the run fits were just not good enough, but secondly, 24% missed tackle rate. You can't have that in the Big Ten from your starting linebacker. You have to see Mason Cobb put it together back again in 2024, and if he does, this USC team on defense, specifically against the run, is going to get a lot better. Now, going to the biggest question mark that I think we all have about this USC team on defense, that's the defensive line. Now, as time has gone on, I've been less pessimistic about the defensive line. You have Gavin Mayer, who's not on this depth chart right now. That certainly helps the depth, but you look at Bear Alexander and say he is one of the most disruptive interior defensive linemen that you see in college football. It sounds like Nate Clifton is going to play on the inside a lot. This is a guy that started 3 straight seasons for Vanderbilt, has played really quality football. I look at Bear Alexander, Nate Clifton, and say, that's a pretty solid starting duo on the inside of the defensive line. I think the bigger question mark is the depth of this unit. It's no secret that you look across the country at the really quality defenses that we've seen in college football. It really does start with depth on the defensive line. These are big bodies that you have to keep fresh, not only for 4 quarters, but 12 plus games of a season. I think the big question is, Gavin Mayer coming from Wyoming, can he be a quality rotational piece on the inside of the defensive line? Can Elijah Hughes take that step in the right direction? He's put on the weight. He certainly looks like a guy that can play on the defensive line in the Big Ten. And then guys like Jide Abasari. I think that this USC defensive line, how good it's going to be specifically depends on the depth that you have on the inside of the defensive line. And there are some other answers to this too, right? You could kick a guy in Anthony Lucas on the inside in certain opportunities because he has the size and the power in his hands to deal with bigger bodies on the inside of the defensive line. And so there are some ways that you can get creative with this defensive front and answer some of those depth problems. Because I look at the edge position and say, Anthony Lucas, Jamil Muhammad, Braylon Shelby, Sam Green, true freshman Cameron Fountain, a guy that looks to play a lot as a true freshman. I really do like where the edge rusher position is for USC. I'm a little bit more worried about the depth on the inside, but you have some bigger edge rushers that you could probably kick to the inside in certain situations. That we'll see how this USC defensive line can handle the Big Ten in 2024, but no doubt it's going to be one of the bigger question marks in terms of if USC comes in the Big Ten, wins a lot of football games, you're going to get good play from the defensive line because you can't win games in the Big Ten without quality play on the defensive line. There are some answers, at least in my mind, with this roster. We know Dan Link can get very creative with his personnel. I am fascinated to see how this defensive line shapes up for USC. The last question mark I have, and that is, can this USC secondary be elite, specifically at the cornerback spot? Right, you bring in John Humphrey, a guy from UCLA who played some very good football, DeCarlos Nicholson from Mississippi State. You have some other guys, true freshmen, Marcellus Williams. That kid looks like he's going to play as a true freshman. Jacoby Covington, you're bringing Greedy Vance at the nickel role. I look at the secondary and say, from a personnel standpoint, I think this unit can be really, really good. Now, why is that such a massive question mark for USC is we talked about, some of the bigger question marks we have on the USC defense being in the front seven. If you trust your secondary, specifically your boundary cornerbacks, to play really good football, you can start putting some safeties into the box and start maybe helping out that USC front seven where we have the question marks. Dan Lynn is going to get very creative with this USC defense. And if you have really good cornerback play going to a conference that I'm a Michigan fan, I'll say that the passing attacks that you're going to see in the Big Ten, they are nowhere near what you saw in the Pac-12 last year. If you can put these cornerbacks out on islands, trust them to win their matchups, you can start loading the box with some of these safeties and really answer some of the questions that USC has in terms of, can you stop the run in the Big Ten? Can you deal with the physicality along the lines of scrimmage? There are answers, and that is just putting more bodies in the box. And if you have cornerbacks that you can trust to play on islands, I think USC, that's a really good recipe for them to deal with some of these more physical Big Ten offenses that you see in 2024. Those are the 5 question marks I have. Again, one of the more fascinating teams, you guys know, heading into 2024, I am fired up to see how this team kind of adjusts to the Big Ten. I think more optimistic than most people around the country with this USC team. A lot to talk about with USC over the next couple of weeks. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Would love to hear from you guys in the comments section relating to some of your biggest question marks for USC. And we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.